Mark Alban, thank you so much for coming on the show to share your stories of Afghanistan. You've, of course, got so much fascinating and incredible stories of the country as well.
Well, it's a great pleasure, and it's a country I really love. So I'm really delighted to do it, Ro.
And there's a streak running through people who've been to Afghanistan, who've worked in Afghanistan. This word love that you mentioned. There's something in Afghanistan that is fascinating or intoxicating, as one of our guests said, Johnny Mercer. What is it about it, and how did you become interested in Afghanistan as a young journalist in the 80s?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is interesting that you say that. I mean, look, obviously, it's physically a very beautiful country. Its people are fascinating, both, I mean, as travelers, we are often quite superficial. So, I mean, starting from the most obvious thing, their appearance is absolutely fascinating. And then, of course, when you get into conversation with people in Afghanistan, I mean, sorry to say, even now, through an interpreter, generally speaking, you hear all sorts of amazing personal stories. So it is a place, I think, that starts with the visual, the way it enthralls you starts with the visual, and then, of course, we start to talk about much more substantive things about the sort of human interactions and the people you meet and the situations you experience. I think it is true to say that with journalists, particularly those who cover conflict, many journalists, I think, become defined by certain conflicts. So, for example, the Lebanese civil war that went through the mid 70s and then through to the Israeli invasion of 1982 and that kind of stuff, that definitely defined a whole sort of group of journalists who covered the Middle East. And I was not such a person. I was at school and university while those events were playing out. I mean, if you go back before that, of course, there was a generation of war correspondents who had defined themselves in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. Now, I think in the 80s there was a group of journalists for whom Afghanistan became the place where we went to sort of prove ourselves as well as to report the story. A lot of these journalists, as you will remember or you'll have read,
I don't
um,
remember. I was not born then.
exactly, you were too young. Well, a lot of these journalists, what they did was they went to Peshawar or possibly Quetta,
Hmm.
and they basically hung out until some commander from the Mujahideen agreed to take them in. Now, often this was a sort of perilous and unpredictable journey. They would set off, and particularly if they were going to somewhere like the Panjshir, they
Yeah.
would have to go in through the high pass. They'd go through Andaman and all these places. And this would take weeks and involve them in all sorts of physical hardship and danger. And I mean, to be frank, I think for some of them, it was like a sort of incredible trekking experience because of the beauty of the country and the kind of bond that they formed in adversity with some of the people, some of the Mujahideen who took them in. Um, I was not such a person. So I had decided at a fairly early stage. Firstly, I was on a very short leash
Mm.
from the Independent, which was the newspaper I was working for at the time. They kind of said, "Okay, you can go for a week." Well, that would prove to be absolutely ridiculous in the end. But that's what I did. My first trip, which was in the late summer of 1987, was for a week. Now, obviously,
I had just been born then. I was a few months old then.
well, there you are. Um, so yes, well, it was a long time ago then.
Yes.
So yeah. So my decision was to go to Kabul and to tell the story in as much as I could in a short trip of what was
Mm.
going on there. And at that time, because Gorbachev had become the Soviet leader in 1985, the mood music was changing a bit, and the Soviet Union was moving towards this decision to leave. And I think they became a little bit more tolerant. I mean, candidly, I think it was still kind of people from The Guardian
Yeah.
or The Independent or whatever who they let in. But they also had a very strong reverence for the BBC. Now, I didn't work for the BBC at the time. I worked for the newspaper. So anyway, I went in 1987, and that's when I formed my first impressions of the country, having had this extraordinary kind of corkscrew landing approach in the Ariana plane flying from Delhi.
Mm.
And because I was a newspaper guy, I was on my own. And so I wasn't like with a team like a TV person might be. And in the long wait for the plane to take off, I got talking to people, and I started hearing all kinds of extraordinary stories. And so someone was pointed out to me across the waiting area in the terminal, and the guy who I was speaking to, who did speak some English, he said, "Oh, this guy, Haji so and so, he's a commander in the Mujahideen." And I thought, hang on a minute, he's about to get on a plane back to Kabul, where the authorities will, if they wanted to, have their chance to get their hands on him. And I just slowly started to realize as the journey went on that, Afghan realities are their own specific type of thing.
Yeah.
And that this guy, this commander, he had some reason for believing that he would be safe traveling through the airport with his family. And he was right. There was no attempt to arrest him or anything. And so I guess he had some kind of understandings,
Mm.
maybe he helped the government in certain ways, and maybe he helped the Mujahideen in others. I don't know.
So yeah, Afghanistan is a kind of the country of, uh, you know, loyalties, double loyalties,
Yes,
unstable
absolutely.
loyalties. Loyalties have never been permanent in that country, so it's probably defined by that as well.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And although yes, I mean, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but although I think sometimes as an outsider, you sort of get this idea that obviously betrayal is the ultimate, as it is in many societies.
Yeah.
And then you get this whole idea about Badal and all these other things that, there's going to be a reckoning, and that, there has to be some kind of revenge after betrayal and all this kind of stuff. And then you get these really weird examples of things in which you see actually a kind of extraordinary pragmatism.
Mm.
So I'll just give this one example, and then we'll go back into chronology. So, for example, there was a general in the pro-Soviet regime called Nurul Haq Ulumi,
Yes.
and he was from this big Kandahar family. And at the moment that the government surrendered
Yeah.
to the Mujahideen, he was the guy. He came out and handed over power, as it were, to Sigbatullah Mujahidi, who came in on
Yeah.
behalf of the alliance of Peshawar parties. Anyway, so many years later, I'm in Kandahar with the whole NATO campaign going on, and actually at this point, I was not embedded.
Mm.
I was taking the risks of being in a little guest house in Kandahar with a cameraman and a security advisor and an interpreter. And I knew that Nurul Haq Ulumi was now an MP for Kandahar. So we went to see him. It was the first time I'd seen him in all those years, in his office in a suburb of Kandahar. And I thought about this as I was driving there, and I thought, hang on a minute. For several years, or a few years, you were the commander of the regime army in this city in the mid to late 80s. Loads of people must have been killed by your
Mm-hmm.
soldiers. You must have had to do all kinds of things, brutal and desperate things to hold on to power in this city. And yet I'm meeting you in your office with no bodyguard. No, I mean, the idea that in Kandahar, if anybody had wanted revenge, it would have been so easy to kill him. And that sort of taught me something really about a kind of pragmatism as well, that in the end, there's this turning of tables and changing of sides and all the rest of it. But people seem to understand at some basic human level that sometimes that's just what people do.
Yeah, and then, how did you find Kabul in those days? And there's a parallel to what's happened after the, pre and after the US withdrawal, is that, there's
Yes.
a lot of speculation about how long the country could resist the Taliban.
Yes.
And there was, I suppose, the same speculations during that time as well, once the Soviets left, that, the regime is going to collapse. But what made that regime different to what made this one falter so quickly?
Gosh, well, that's a big question. So, Kabul, when I first went there, 1987, and then I went back for a much longer trip. I was there for a few weeks in 1988. And then I was there again in the early part, and again for a few weeks of 1989 as the last Soviet soldiers left. There was a kind of paradox in a way, because during the Soviet occupation, the population of the city had more than doubled, because lots of people from areas that were insecure came into Kabul for security. And indeed, the Soviet army had these defensive belts around the city, and it was quite secure. And I can say to you quite honestly that when I walked around the bazaar in Kabul in 1988, say, I felt safer than I did there during the period of NATO operations. Now, in part, of course, that was because I was a Westerner, and I could very quickly say "Shuravinistan" if I thought people started to question me in an aggressive way in the bazaar or something. I could say, that I was a sort of Khabarnagar Inglisi and all this sort of stuff. I could quickly communicate who I was, and once I'd done that, people were very trusting. I was perfectly safe. And so the paradox was this, that the city population had grown enormously. Obviously, the people who'd come in from the surrounding districts, some of them were pro-regime and some of them were really not. They had different views about, what was happening to the country. But notwithstanding the fact that in that sense, the city was booming, in the commercial sense, it really wasn't. And there were very few, for example, I know it sounds a bit glib, but there were very few restaurants open, or very few. There were only 2 hotels that you could stay at, one of which was the Intercon, which generally was the favorite of the press. But because it was so far out to the west of the city, I didn't want to stay there. So I stayed in the Kabul hotel, which later became the Serena when it was modernized. But as you know, the Kabul hotel was the first one established in Afghanistan, I think in the 1920s. And it had a very it was very nicely proportioned and cool in the summer heat. And it was bang in the middle of things. It was right opposite the presidential palace and some of the other main bits of the government. So that's where I stayed. So that was the situation really, Roh, which was that there were a lot of people in the city. It was a bustling city. It was quite a safe city in its feel, but it was not commercially vibrant. When the Soviets left, and I think this is one of the keys to the survival of Najibullah for more than 2 years after the Soviets left, he liberalized various economic laws and things. And suddenly, when I went back in like 92 or whatever, the place was sort of flourishing commercially. There were loads of new businesses. There was a lot of business coming in from Pakistan, all of which had been sealed off, really. There was a very small amount of business coming in from Pakistan during the Soviet period, because, of course, they tried to seal the border. Whereas Najibullah still, in theory, had a kind of insurgency problem, supported by the ISI and everything else from Pakistan. But he completely liberalized the regime. And so you would get these huge lines of trucks at the customs house at the east of the city, of people bringing in, produce and everything from Pakistan. And the place was much more sort of vibrant and bustling when Najibullah was in charge. And you referred to the period, the sort of moment of truth when the Soviet army left in February 1989, and I was there at that time too. And quite a few journalists were very reluctant to be there. They thought it was going to turn into a bloodbath, and that the Mujahideen would come into the city, the whole system would collapse. And I didn't think that. My belief was, firstly, that the Mujahideen were very disunited, and that in various battles that I had studied, they had shown themselves not really capable of taking like provincial centers and things like that. And therefore I thought, well, what chance have they got of taking Kabul when, it's got these defense belts, which when the Soviets left, they handed over to the Afghan army and, Sarandoy and all these people. And Najibullah, when they left, he had quite a lot of troops and police and everything under arms. I think he had 250 or 300,000 security forces. And we knew that key to the survival of the regime would be keeping open the road from the north, the Salang highway, because things like the fuel for the power station would come that way. And as you know, because they didn't have a proper tax system, the charging people to travel the road and taking the money and taking the customs duties from Khairatan and these other places was also an important part of government stability. It's how I knew the Ghani government was going to fall very quickly when they lost Spin Buldak. And so we knew this was key.
Yeah.
So we heard, they're bringing down sort of 200 trucks, and they're going to try and bring them through today. So we took a taxi up to Khairkhana, in the northern part. And in the distance, we could hear the booming of artillery and the sea smoke coming up. And we thought, okay, it's happening. They're bringing this convoy down. The survival of the regime depends on them getting this through.
Yeah, the parcels.
Yeah. And lo and behold, it made it through. And I thought, okay. Then I heard with subsequent convoys, oh yeah, they're not going to bring them down that road, which was the main, Highway 1. It was the main road up towards Jabal al-Sarraj and the Salang. They've made a new road that goes across the desert from Bagram to the east of the city, somewhere near the airport. I said, what? They said, yeah. Najibullah's military have now they're in charge. They're going to do things their way. They're not going to do things the Soviet way. And they've made a new road to bypass all these places in the Shomali, north of the city, where the Mujahideen were based. And then they just started bringing down these convoys whenever they wanted to. And so I thought, okay, they're going to make it. And I think a lot of the commanders, there was a big battle in Jalalabad after the Russians left.
Yeah, with Hizb Islami.
Yeah. And a lot of the commanders, when that failed, just decided, you know what? And of course, because Najibullah was a mixture of kind of, thug, pragmatist, and prince.
And a Pashtun nationalist and Ahmadzai and all of that. He was playing very well on that.
Yeah, he had this way of inviting some of these guys in and making them an offer they couldn't refuse, either to become militia, to sort of protect the road sort of thing, obviously for money, or just with coercion to say, well, you can carry on doing what you're doing, but it will end badly for you. And that's how, for a couple of years, he turned things around. And as you know, in the end, because of the issues with Dostum in the north, I mean, it really, in the end, was an argument about dividing the spoils
Yeah.
of the, you know, the money. But once all this trade was flowing, and the trade from Central Asia down through Afghanistan, quite a lot of it through the Spin Buldak Quetta route to Karachi, became a big trading route that he could just milk it by charging people money to use various highways, or you know, and the army, he had enough coercion going on to make sure that the commanders, the military commanders, were basically putting the money into the national coffers rather than their own pockets. And obviously, ultimately, that was the issue with Dostum that caused him to fall out and caused the coup against him. Now, some people say, oh, well, you know, he fell because of the end of the Soviet Union. Well, yes, it's true. You know, he wasn't getting the same supplies of weapons. But, you know, Najibullah was so shrewd. I think what would have happened if he hadn't had this falling out with Dostum is he would have strengthened his military ties with India and other places that would have provided the basic military needs to keep the regime going. I don't think the fall of the Soviet Union by itself was the thing that brought him down.
On the falling of the regime, of course, you were in Kabul, but how did you get yourself to be with Ahmad Shah Massoud when he was descending into Kabul?
Yeah. So, a couple of days after Najibullah had taken refuge at the UN, well, this was when Dostum mounted a coup against him, and he fled to this UN office in the city. I managed to get back in again. Obviously, we had to scramble and get in, and we managed to get in on a flight. And I think maybe the next day or the day after, the flight stopped. And the situation at that point was, as I've described, this great convoy of guys in kind of, you know, Toyota Hiluxes and technicals arrived from Peshawar, hundreds of mujahideen. And there were these massive celebrations and, you know, firing into the night sky and all this kind of stuff. And the regime, in the person of this general, Nur al-Haq Ulumi, had handed over power to Mujahidi, who at the time was the chair of the Peshawar Mujahid Alliance.
Yeah.
So there was then this sort of tense moment where everybody sort of thought, okay, what's going to happen now? So there was an attempt to, and everybody understood that Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Hizb Islami would face off against Ahmad Shah Massoud. So we thought, well, we need to go north and we need to find them and we need to talk to them. And there was a group from Hizb Islami who were in the Shomali, and the commander of this group was nominated by Gulbuddin to be prime minister. I'm afraid his name escapes me. He was a significant figure in Afghan history for about a week and a half.
Okay.
So what we did was we went to go and see him, and we found him. We interviewed him. And at the end of the interview, we said, oh, by the way, to avoid problems, if we want to come back and talk to you again, can we have a pass? And, you know, in many parts of Afghanistan, the commanders issued these little, I mean, they were just little bits of paper with stamps.
Yes,
yeah. Can we have a pass so that your checkpoints will let us back through to you? And lo and behold, literally, it was either the next day or the day after, things began to come to a boil. And we heard rumor that Ahmad Shah Massoud was going to move on the city. So we drove north. And whereas all the other journalists got stopped by the Hezb Islami guys on the road, we had the pass. So they let us through. And then, of course, we didn't go back to talk to their boss a second time. We went to find Massud, and we heard the story was, oh, you know, go to Jabal al-Sarraj. because the army garrison there has just changed sides to backing Massud. So we went there, and quite frankly, I mean, you know how it is. You could wait in Afghanistan months for something to happen, like some of those guys who went in on mules.
Yes.
And we saw everything happen in the space of about 3 or 4 hours, and it was quite staggering. So,
as it happened in August.
Yes, yeah, in a way, yes. And we arrived there, and there was a lot of hubbub, and there were already some guys from Massoud's sort of main mobile units that were called motoraks.
Yeah.
And these were like company strength. They were like 100 to 120 guys, and they were his best trained people. And a couple of these units had arrived in the army camp. And then we started to see guys coming down from, the slopes. And more of them arrived. There were like 6 or 7 of them, of these units. So there were like several hundred soldiers, all concentrating at this point. So we thought, well, we're going to stick around. And then Massud himself appeared, and I hadn't met him before. And there were like maybe 2 other journalists there, but we really almost had it to ourselves. And he arrived, and these units were formed up in almost like on a sort of parade square in the army base there. And he walked along the lines of soldiers. And it really was like something out of antiquity or one of the great battles of history. He walked along the line of soldiers, like haranguing them, and they were all chanting back to him. And every now and then he would stop and he would exchange some, friendly words with one of the local commanders, or, with one of the junior guys in his army.
And was he aware that you were there filming?
Yes, absolutely. We were walking along with him as he walked along this line of troops, haranguing them.
Was he kind of putting a show, or he was like that?
Yes, I think to some extent. And then the most extraordinary thing happened. He had done a deal with the commander of the helicopter regiment, the Afghan Army helicopter regiment. So there was one main, there were various detachments around the country, but in, I think either Bagram or Kabul, they had like 20 helicopters that were used for, and one by one, I think I counted something like 16 helicopters came into land around this army base. And it was like, oh my God, what's going on? And he then gave his orders, and he had a couple of hundred guys who he sent with a group of armored vehicles on the road, but they knew that this Hizb Islami group was on the road. So they might have to fight, they might not. But he sent most of his guys, he sent 200-300 of his guys on these helicopters. And they just flew to Kabul to seize power. And so a guy we were working with, who's quite a figure in the history of Afghanistan, Peter Juvenal, we'd hired him for a few days. So we said to Peter, right, you go with the helicopters, we'll go with the ground column. And which is what we did. We followed behind the ground column. And actually, when the moment came, the Hizb Islami guys, I think they knew they'd been outmaneuvered, and they didn't want to fire the first shot. So they just stood there at the checkpoints as all these vehicles went by with Massoud's people. And his helicopter troops arrived at the airport and started fanning out in the city. And then the ground column arrived. And basically, he'd taken power. But there were still some armed guys from other factions holding other key places. So in the middle of the city, you had this bizarre thing on sort of opposite street corners or even opposite sides of the same avenue, where there'd be Massoud guys on one side, and they started digging in to like flower beds and things and making trenches. And the guys on the other side of the road would be watching them. And I remember asking them, why aren't you shooting one another? It was like, well, we haven't had the orders yet. Anyway, sadly, I think the next day it did all start. And of course that was...
But I think there's a fascinating thing about that time is that there is a radio exchange between Massoud, which is widely available now, on YouTube as well. So where he's on a radio exchange with Hekmatyar, who's
Mm.
in the, his arch enemy or rival on the east of the city, and he's on the north part, where he's warning him not to enter Kabul, and he's kind of telling him not to enter Kabul. They're having a go at each other, and
Yes.
what was kind of that dynamic? I mean, did you sense that Massud felt, okay, I have to get there before Hekmatyar gets? I mean,
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's what in the British Army they would call a coup de main operation, which it's a French phrase,
hmm,
but it literally means like stroke of the hand, or I mean, he was seizing his moment, Massud, and he was such a shrewd guy, and he was such a sort of a good commander, that he knew this was the moment he'd been fighting for 9 years or whatever for, and that he had to take his moment. And I think in that sense, he kind of outmaneuvered Hekmatyar in that sense, because I think Hekmatyar thought that this sort of emerging agreement for power sharing, where his guy would be prime minister, his proxy,
yeah.
his commander, would sort of be enough, and that Massud could, be whatever, and yeah, I mean, I haven't heard that recording, but what then happened once Massud had done his coup de main
Yeah.
and taken that, not the whole city, but those central parts, as you say, on the north and the airport, he Hekmatyar gave an ultimatum. And I mean, once again, we managed to insert ourselves into the drama. We drove down to Sarubi and we interviewed Hekmatyar
Oh,
in
so you've
English.
met the two men.
Yeah, in English.
Ah.
And that whole occasion was, you know, very odd and sort of suffused with kind of menace, because we drove down there. We'd heard, we'd had word that he would see us, and we drove in and he wasn't there.
Mm.
And time wore on. And basically, we were put in a room and told, you go in there. And there was an English speaking guy who did sort of publicity for him, who recognized me and started accusing me of writing various disobliging things about Hezb Islami and calling various people traitors. It started to become a bit uncomfortable. Then it became clear that we were not free to leave the room they had put us in.
Oh, you're being kept hostage by
Well,
Hezbollah. I mean,
we didn't
captive, I suppose.
understand, we weren't sure what was going on, and we were getting quite nervous because we knew we needed a good hour to get back into the city, because you had to drive up the
Mm.
Kabul gorge. Um, and, we were thinking about the light and the fact that we didn't want to be traveling up back into the city in darkness. And in the end, suddenly Hekmatyar appeared just as the sun was beginning to set. And he
Mhm.
agreed to give this interview, and he did it outside. And of course, because the sun was going down, it was beautiful orange light. And he was in a good mood. So he did the interview in English, which I'm told that he often refused to do when he was in Peshawar. I'd never tried to interview him before. And he to be frank, he gave quite a good interview. And his English was very good. And he didn't show any kind of like annoyance, or it was, as they would say these days, a pretty good vibe between us
Mm.
and him, notwithstanding the fact that for a couple of hours we'd been prevented from leaving.
There was a time that he'd lost Kabul to Massud already, isn't
Well,
it?
he was about to. Yes, he'd lost it. Yeah, he was about to, but he was about to start fighting him. So he'd issued his ultimatum, and we left, and obviously we were keen. We were probably driving too fast because we wanted to get back in the city before it was completely dark. By the time we got to the customs house up on the Jalalabad road on the eastern side of the city, it was completely dark. But anyway, we got back and we thought, wow, we've got an interview with Hekmatyar. But, a few weeks later, the correspondent from the BBC Pashto service did not make it back. And there was a lot of discussion about whether or not he'd annoyed Gulbuddin during the interview, and what had subsequently happened to him. So, it was.
And what kind of a character did you find him? I mean, both of them. I mean, contrasting characters. I mean, how did you find both men in terms of characters? I mean, Massud, both of these men are, villains to some and heroes to others.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
Well, Massud, I kept trying to ask him questions, and he was engaged in something quite important, and he in the end he got quite annoyed with me, but then agreed to answer, say, 2 questions. By this point we were sitting in an office, and as I say, there were 2 or 3 other journalists there, and we each got to ask 1 or 2 questions. But notwithstanding the fact that he got angry with me, which was in a sense entirely understandable, he was a very charismatic figure, and we had seen him, haranguing his troops like some modern day Sikandar. I mean, it was quite extraordinary. I mean, his charisma was quite extraordinary.
And the looks?
Oh yeah, very handsome, and with a sort of physical self-confidence. Gulbuddin was much more like a guy who sort of belonged in some very austere madrasa. And when you spoke to him, there was a sort of focus and an intensity. He was weighing his words carefully, and in someone else's language, in English, clearly extremely clever, a very smart person, but somebody who did not communicate that kind of physical charisma and sort of personal warmth.
And is that because, do you think that smartness has kept him alive to date?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that thing also that we were talking about before, that it's this sort of slightly odd paradox about Afghan politics, that there's all this shedding of blood and double dealing and changing of sides and all the rest of it, but somehow people seem to sort of allow some of the key leaders and key commanders to do this, and I mean, I could give many examples. There were quite a few people, who I think subsequently people in the country had very mixed feelings about, because they'd been warlords during the Civil War period, who ended up in the parliament when the Americans toppled the Taliban. And a lot of people would say, oh God, this guy, he's a terrible warlord. He destroyed, well, you had the name escapes me, the leader of the group that was in Pugman. They were also quite a strong Islamist group, and they aligned themselves with the Northern Alliance. Sayyaf is who I'm
yes, Sayyaf. I mean, he just, yeah.
So of course, a lot of people, because of what had happened in the Civil War in the west of the city, there'd been a lot of destruction because Sayyaf's people were fighting.
Of course, they massacred the Hazaras in the west of Kabul, and
I mean, well, as you know better than anybody, the crimes. I mean, and yet he became a figure in this new setup.
Yeah,
and nobody, took revenge against him and killed him. And there were lots, as I say, there were these characters like Nurul Hakulumi. Okay, he hadn't been a warlord, but he had been the kind of
Najib's man.
Najibullah's man running Kandahar. So, and yet, so Gulbuddin, in a sense, he falls into that category of survivors. But I mean, he, he is a pretty extraordinary character. I guess his key calculation always has been to stay on the right side of Pakistan.
Yeah. And the thing is, so you left Afghanistan. Afghanistan descends into this, you know, chaotic, deadly civil war. The Taliban appears, 9/11 happens, Afghanistan becomes relevant again for the West. You went back after, you know, Kabul was liberated from again, you know, from the north of Kabul with your colleague John Simpson accompanying the forces who are
Yeah,
descending
he was
into
in
Kabul.
before me. I have to say,
Yes.
in fairness, liberating Kabul. No, he got there before I did. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, of course,
so
he had waited. He had waited on the plane, and they'd got to a point because it was getting late in the year, wasn't it? And the snow was coming in the high passes. And
yeah.
I think they got to a point where they couldn't go back. The BBC realized
To
they
be
couldn't,
fair to Simpson, I mean, you know, we had him on the podcast in the previous one as well.
I'm
You
sure.
know, he's been such a great friend as well. You know, he before that, I mean, 79, he took Ayatollah Khomeini to Tehran. You know, the man's had a lot to do with the
Yeah,
region.
yeah, absolutely.
Uh,
No, I'm applauding his commitment in staying there, waiting for Kabul to fall beyond the point where
yeah.
it became clear that his obvious route out was closing because the snow was taking over the high passes and he couldn't get out. So in a sense, his only way was forward. Whereas we came in from Peshawar via the obvious route, through Jalalabad.
Hmm.
And it was pretty chaotic though that time.
Yeah.
And we were in a minibus coming through Sarubi, and someone said, "Oh, there are spies," and big crowd formed. People tried to pull us out of the minibus. The driver just kept his foot down, pushing through the crowd. We got through. We were very, very uneasy after we got through, and then literally hours later, a group of 4 Western journalists were murdered just north of Sarubi.
Hmm.
I mean, it was a really kind of tumultuous time.
So you get back to Kabul after the Civil War. How did you find the whole thing? I mean, in looking back now, how did it feel?
Yeah, as I say, it was pretty wild, and there was a sense of flux in in the city as well, of one authority that had disappeared and another, the Northern Alliance, that was sort of struggling to make itself felt. I mean, strange things happened. For example, we went out to Pulachaki, and already they had released prisoners from there, and there was nothing to see. So then we went back into the city, and we went to this place that used to be called the Khad prison because it was
Yeah.
underneath the intelligence building. And there we found that the Northern Alliance had these prisoners. There were about um, a dozen of them that we saw there in a basement, in cells
Hmm.
under this building. And these guys, they were your actual international jihadists. I think they had come from Tajikistan.
Hmm.
They were certainly Central Asian in appearance. And we thought, gosh, what are the chances of these guys surviving? And I'll tell you another story about that in a moment, about the mood there
Hmm.
against Al Qaeda and the Arabs and the foreign fighters. And then actually, while we were there, I was quite nervous about filming them, to be honest. So I said to the camera man to film them in such a way that they couldn't be identified. And then while we were there, the International Red Cross people arrived and started to take their personal details. Sorry, they weren't from Tajikistan, they were from Uzbekistan.
Yeah.
And that kind of gave me quite a lot of reassurance. I thought, well, okay, I feel much better about these guys and whether they're going to survive now
Yeah.
because they're on a list now with the Red Cross. and it's going to be tricky. But I'll give you a contrasting example, which is we were talking about Pagman and the Sayaf people. So Peter Juvenal went up to Pagman on our behalf. So he was still kind of working with us, or he was working with us again, sorry. As a freelance. And he knew the commander up there. And this guy had thrown in his lot with the Northern Alliance. And he said, look, I think I can work something. I think there's this rumor that he's got some Arabs. Left behind, when the Taliban.
They were known as Arab Afghans or something like that.
Yeah, a week or two before the Taliban had fled Kabul, and some of these guys hadn't got the memo. And so he went up there and he came back. And that evening, we met up at the I think it was at Peter's Hotel. And we said, well, what happened? He said, well, they've got some, 5 or 6 guys. And we said, well, did you see them? He said, no, they were locked in a container that, one of these freight containers that quite a lot of the warlords used them as like prisons. And we said, oh my God. But the guy I was trying to find, he wasn't there. So they said, come back tomorrow. And we said, okay, great. You go back tomorrow, get permission to film them, and then we'll come up. And we'll do we'll talk to these guys. But anyway, the next night we said, Peter, what happened? He said, yeah, I went back. Was the commander? Yes. Well, what happened? He said, well, I asked him, we'd like to film an interview with your Arab foreign fighter prisoners. And he said, oh, we killed them. And that was it. So there was quite a lot of that going on. And so those guys from Uzbekistan who we saw being registered by the Red Cross, I mean, I've got no idea whether they ended up in Guantanamo or what happened to them. But I'm hoping that they didn't suffer the same fate. And because the Red Cross had logged them, hopefully
and Mark, I'm really conscious of your time as well. I'm so grateful. Now, you reported from Afghanistan, you reported from Iraq, Kosovo, all the conflict zones. And of course, you've done an enormous amount of work in Britain as well as a military historian. You've written many books. What's happened in Afghanistan, I've always said, is, this is not the conclusion to the story of Afghanistan. The Taliban's takeover, for many, I think for, naive reasons, that this is the end of the story. As we can look through the country's history, for me, it's just a phase. The Taliban are not going to be a permanent fixture of the Afghanistan's future. Now, with your expertise, how do you see things? So what are your assessments of the country?
Oh dear. Well, there were various times in this where I would kind of got madly and naively optimistic. So after the fall of Najibullah, after the fall of the Taliban, I think to myself, yeah, things are going to be great. I'm going to bring my wife here on holiday.
To Bamyan, the Bandamir.
Exactly. I had all those kind of dreams that there would be a moment where I could bring my wife or my family, and we would, show them all these. I would show them all these places that are so beautiful. The Kabul Gorge and all these other things that are so beautiful and meant a lot to me for various reasons. And each time, my hopes were dashed. So I think I'm a kind of lousy predictor in that sense of what's happening, and in a way, maybe it's kind of nice, or maybe it's a bit hopeless that I remain in some ways still optimistic. But I don't think in the end that the system, particularly in regard to women, there can stay as it is. Now, whether it's a very, very long and gradual process of evolution, as we know, one of the differences between Taliban 1.0 and Taliban 2.0 was allowing education for girls up to the high school level. Whereas with Taliban 1.0, there was none at all.
Hmm.
Now you might say, great, that's amazing progress. Well, it is progress of a sort, because I think they felt a social pressure that they just couldn't do it. They couldn't do what they'd done during their first period in government. And one just hopes that in some ways, those kinds of social pressures prove to be, operative to bring about a long-term change. I mean, people are going there again now, aren't they? And they're even trying to revive some tourism and to say, oh, well, the country's really safe now. Crack down on the drugs trade as they did during the first period in power. That's my only hope, really, for gradual change. I mean, one thing I definitely think, having experienced, both the Soviet and NATO operations there, is this is really not a job for foreign armies and for foreigners to oversee. It has to come. It has to be an organic thing. And of course, when you have a large coercive apparatus in the way the Taliban do, to keep people, particularly women, in their place, that's very hard. But it has to be a long, slow evolution, I think.
And what did the Afghanistan experience and the defeat, the manner of the withdrawal, given how highly connected you are in the diplomatic circles, and of course, understanding the West, there are not many who does as best as you do. What did it do to the West, the Afghanistan experience, and how will it be looked at, 10 years, 20 years down the line, given what's going on in Ukraine and elsewhere?
Well, one of the things which I think I should quickly do before we finish, is contrast, what the military call the end state.
Yeah.
What do you leave behind is effectively what we're talking about. That was there when the Soviets left versus when NATO left. And in many ways, the Soviet end state was better. Firstly, because they had assisted Najibullah to build up this very large security force. Secondly, because Najibullah, through this curious combination of kind of some weird residual left-wing ideology that came obviously from the old Parcham element, the party element.
Yeah.
But also with his, as you say, his status as an Ahmadzai, his status as a former chief of secret police. He was a brutal man. He had all these different qualities.
Charisma as well. He had a certain level of charisma.
Yes, I think so. Yeah. I mean, I saw him at the rally the day the Soviet army left. And yeah, he was thoroughly enjoying himself. I mean, everybody thought, okay, he's going to get it now. But he looked like he was thoroughly enjoying himself there. He projected confidence. But I mean, the point is that the party had a very unusual thing. It had this sort of cadre of people in the country. And if you went back, to 1985 or whatever, and there'd be you'd read from some Mujahideen communique that some guy had been pulled off a bus in, Musakala district in Helmand or in the Arghandab in Kandahar or somewhere. And he'd been murdered because he was the local party secretary.
Yeah.
And actually, he was an Uzbek. And actually, he was on his way to take up his position. And when you sort of analyze these incidents and you thought, oh my God, this guy was willing to take that risk to travel up there with barely any protection because he believed in something. He believed in this ideology, people sometimes call it communism. In a sense, it wasn't really communism, but it was a sort of left-wing nationalist ideology. So what they did was they sent thousands of people to colleges, technical colleges, and university in the Soviet Union.
Hmm.
They made this investment in the human capital of the country. And that combination of the slightly odd left-wing ideology and the investment made in the, whatever you want to call them, technocrats,
Yeah.
educated people of the country, was the big difference between the Soviet end state and the NATO one. And I would be going around, like, I mentioned Arghandab, like in 2009, embedded, and it would be, meet the local, corps commander in Kandahar. And when I realized that he'd been trained by the Russians, and I speak very poor Russian, but when I would start to communicate with him direct rather than through an interpreter in Russian, his face lit up. And he actually said to me, because I explained when I'd been there, he said, tell me about those times. He was nostalgic for the Najibullah period, and he wanted to talk about it. And I found that time and again, going around during the NATO period, that the guys that they relied on as brigade commanders and corps commanders and whatever were people who the Russians had trained. And I think, in a sense, that was the big failure of the Western involvement. The failure to coalesce a sort of national cadre of people through a combination of education, which they did give to some.
Yeah.
I mean, people were sent to learn to be pilots in America and stuff like that. Did happen. But of course, what was missing was this ideological component. And of course, that would have been very hard for the Western countries to have done. I mean, what sort of ideology would it be apart from some basic lessons about sort of civics and democracy and tolerating opposing opinions and different groups in society and stuff like that? I mean, what would this ideology have been? And that was the fundamental difference. So now we come back to your question about, I mean, you can answer much better than I can, Ro, like how Afghan people have changed their view of the West or of America or of Britain or whatever as a consequence of what happened 3 years ago. Clearly, it's a tragedy. And of course, I know many of the guys who were serving in the British military there, a lot of whom are deeply scarred, I think, by the way that the government was allowed to collapse, and therefore the way the sacrifices of their friends were sort of thrown to the winds in that way. I think the combination of Iraq and Afghanistan caused a sort of great retrenchment, particularly in the United States, a desire to avoid any kind of nation building or long-term mandate in the future. And in a way, that's why, in the end, the sort of Doha agreement was such a sort of sellout, because the US was just so desperate in the end to bring that involvement to a conclusion. And now we see it again. There's many parts of the world where you could argue, well, it would be good if the Americans could be a bit more present on the ground, even in small numbers, in an advisory role or something like that. But they really have, in a sense, learned that lesson of history, that, not to be in places where they will end up being, blown up and sniped at and all the rest of it, and not to make those commitments. So I think it has had a profound effect in causing a sort of retrenchment of not exactly an isolationism, but certainly a desire not to get involved, particularly in things like nation building.
We spoke about, we've been at length discussing the personalities, Massud, Hekmatyar, Sayyaf, and others, and importantly, Najib as well. What contrasts them with Ashraf Ghani, who legged it in the British jargon?
Yes. Well, I was on my way into the country during the period the NATO period, let's call it that, you know, the period of the NATO war. But while Hamid Karzai was still the president, and I was waiting for a flight in Dubai, and I think it was the dreaded Cam Air flying to Kabul, and business class, whatever. So we get shown to the lounge, and there I realize on the other side of the lounge is Ashraf Ghani. Now I understood at the time, I can't remember whether he was working at the World Bank but he was already being spoken of as a possible successor to Karzai. So I thought, well, they've just announced they won't be boarding the flight for 2 hours.
But journalistic instinct.
Yeah, so I sidled over, let's share a cup of tea, and we started talking. And then when they called the flight, I realized that I was sitting next to him. So the conversation then just continued. So I had the pleasure of a sort of, I don't know how long it was in the end, 3 or 4 hour long audience with Ashraf Ghani. And it was, journalistically, it was fantastic because it was a chance to get a good measure of a guy who people were speaking of as a possible future leader. And I came away from it thinking, oh my word, this guy, I mean, he's so educated. He's got such a good mind, he understands the problems so well. He would start to talk about, capacity building in Afghan ministries and the need, he had all this sense of what needed to be done to try and bring the country, to modernize the country more rapidly. And at the end of it all, I thought, he's got all these fantastic qualities, but is he enough of a bastard? And I just thought, he's not. He's too highly educated. Because I was thinking about him in contrast to Najibullah, and the way that Najibullah used a combination of kind of exhortation and fear to control people. And I thought, he's just not enough of a bastard. He's not tough enough for this job. And I think in the end, with the way things unraveled, we saw that not only was he sort of living in a bit of a bubble, he lacked the grip to understand how quickly things were deteriorating. But in the end, he lacked the courage to try and face it down, even if that meant that he might die.
I'm so grateful for your time, Mark, and thank you so much. And
it's a pleasure.
Thank you.